Stepan Arkadyevitch had learned easily at school, thanks to his excellent abilities, but he had been idle and mischievous, and therefore was one of the lowest in his class. But in spite of his habitually dissipated mode of life, his inferior grade in the service, and his comparative youth, he occupied the honorable and lucrative position of president of one of the government boards at Moscow. This post he had received through his sister Anna's husband, Alexey Alexandrovich Karenina, who held one of the most important positions in the ministry to whose department the Moscow office belonged. But if Karenina had not got his brother-in-law this job, then through 100 other personages, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts, Stepan Oblonsky would have received this post or some other similar one, together with the salary of 6,000 absolutely needful for him, as his affairs, in spite of his wife's considerable property, were in an embarrassed condition. Half Moscow and Petersburg were friends and relations of Stepan Arkadyevitch. He was born in the midst of those who had been and are the powerful ones of this world. 1/3 of the men in the government, the older men, had been friends of his father's and had known him in petticoats. Another third were his intimate chums, and the remainder were friendly acquaintances. Consequently, the distributors of earthly blessings in the shape of places, rents, shares, and such, were all his friends, and could not overlook one of their own set. And Oblonsky had no need to make any special exertion to get a lucrative post. He had only not to refuse things, not to show jealousy, not to be quarrelsome or take offense, all of which from his characteristic good nature he never did. It would have struck him as absurd if he had been told that he would not get a position with the salary he required, especially as he expected nothing out of the way. He only wanted what the men of his own age and standing did get, and he was no worse qualified for performing duties of the kind than any other man. Stepan Arkadyevitch was not merely liked by all who knew him for his good humor, but for his bright disposition and his unquestionable honesty. In him, in his handsome, radiant figure, his sparkling eyes, black hair and eyebrows, and the white and red of his face, there was something which produced a physical effect of kindliness and good humor on the people who met him. "Ah, Stepan Oblonsky, here he is," was almost always said with a smile of delight on meeting him, even though it happened at times that after a conversation with him it seemed that nothing particularly delightful had happened. The next day, and the next, everyone was just as delighted at meeting him again. After filling for 3 years the post of president of one of the government boards at Moscow, Stepan Arkadyevitch had won the respect as well as the liking of his fellow officials, subordinates, and superiors, and all who had had business with him. The principal qualities in Stepan Arkadyevitch which had gained him this universal respect in the service consisted, in the first place, of his extreme indulgence for others, founded on a consciousness of his own shortcomings. Second, of his perfect liberalism. Not the liberalism he read of in the papers, but the liberalism that was in his blood, in virtue of which he treated all men perfectly equal and exactly the same, whatever their fortune or calling might be. And thirdly, the most important point, his complete indifference to the business in which he was engaged, in consequence of which he was never carried away and never made mistakes. On reaching the offices of the board, Stepan Arkadyevitch, escorted by a deferential porter with a portfolio, went into his little private room, put on his uniform, and went into the boardroom. The clerks and copyists all rose, greeting him with good-humored deference. Stepan Arkadyevitch moved quickly as ever to his place, shook hands with his colleagues, and sat down. He made a joke or two, and talked just as much as was consistent with due decorum, and began work. No one knew better than Stepan Arkadyevitch how to hit on the exact line between freedom, simplicity, and official stiffness necessary for the agreeable conduct of business. A secretary, with the good-humored deference common to everyone in Stepan Arkadyevitch's office, came up with the papers and began to speak in the familiar and easy tone which had been introduced by Stepan Arkadyevitch. "We have succeeded in getting the government information from Penza. Here, would you care?" "You got them at last?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, laying his finger on the paper. "Now, gentlemen." And the sitting of the board began. "If they knew," he thought, bending his head with a significant air as he listened to the report, "what a guilty little boy their president was half an hour ago." And his eyes were laughing during the reading of the report. Till 2 o'clock the sitting would go on without a break, and at 2 o'clock there would be an interval and luncheon. It was not yet 2 when the large glass doors of the boardroom suddenly opened and someone came in. All the officials sitting on the further side under the portrait of the Tsar and the eagle, delighted at any distraction, looked round at the door, but the doorkeeper standing at the door at once drove out the intruder and closed the glass door after him. When the case had been read through, Stepan Arkadyevitch got up and stretched, and by way of tribute to the liberalism of the times, took out a cigarette in the boardroom, and went into his private room. 2 of the members of the board, the old veteran in the service, Nikitin, and the Kammerjunker Grinovitch, went in with him. "We shall have time to finish after lunch," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "To be sure we shall," said Nikitin. "A pretty sharp fellow this Fomin must be," said Grinovitch, one of the persons taking part in the case they were examining. Stepan Arkadyevitch frowned at Grinovitch's words, giving him thereby to understand that it was improper to pass judgment prematurely, and made him no reply. "Who was that came in?" he asked the doorkeeper. "Someone, Your Excellency, crept in without permission directly when my back was turned. He was asking for you. I told him, when the members come out, then—" "Where is he?" "Maybe he's gone into the passage, but here he comes anyway. That is he," said the doorkeeper, pointing to a strongly built, broad-shouldered man with a curly beard, who, without taking off his sheepskin cap, was running lightly and rapidly up the worn steps of the stone staircase. One of the members going down, a lean official with a portfolio, stood out of his way and looked disapprovingly at the legs of the stranger, then glanced inquiringly at Oblonsky. Stepan Arkadyevitch was standing at the top of the stairs. His good-naturedly beaming face, above the embroidered collar of his uniform, beamed more than ever when he recognized the man coming up. "Why, it's actually you, Levin, at last," he said with a friendly, mocking smile, scanning Levin as he approached. "How is it that you have deigned to look me up in this den?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. Not content with shaking hands, he kissed his friend. "Have you been here long?" "I have just come, and I very much wanted to see you," said Levin, looking shyly and at the same time angrily and uneasily around. "Well, let's go into my room," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, who knew his friend's sensitive and irritable shyness, and taking his arm he drew him along as though guiding him through dangers. Stepan Arkadyevitch was on familiar terms with almost all his acquaintances, and called almost all of them by their Christian names: old men of 60, boys of 20, actors, ministers, merchants, generals, so that many of his intimate chums were to be found at the extreme ends of the social ladder, and would have been very much surprised to learn that they had, through the medium of Oblonsky, something in common. He was the familiar friend of every one with whom he took a glass of champagne, and he took a glass of champagne with everyone. And when, in consequence, he met any of his disreputable chums, as he used in joke to call many of his friends, in the presence of his subordinates, he well knew how, with his characteristic tact, to diminish the disagreeable impression made on them. Levin was not a disreputable chum, but Oblonsky, with his ready tact, felt that Levin fancied he might not care to show his intimacy with him before his subordinates, and so he made haste to take him off into his room. Levin was almost of the same age as Oblonsky. Their intimacy did not rest merely on champagne. Levin had been the friend and companion of his early youth. They were fond of one another in spite of the difference of their characters and taste, as friends are fond of one another who have been together in early youth. But in spite of this, each of them, as is often the way with men who have selected careers of different kinds, though in discussion he would even justify the other's career, in his heart despised it. It seemed to each of them that the life he led himself was the only real life, and the life led by his friend was a mere phantasm. Oblonsky could not restrain a slight mocking smile at the sight of Levin. How often he had seen him come up to Moscow from the country where he was doing something, but what precisely Stepan Arkadyevitch could never quite make out, and indeed he took no interest in the matter. Levin arrived in Moscow in a hurry, rather ill at ease and irritated by his own want of ease, and for the most part with a perfectly new, unexpected view of things. Stepan Arkadyevitch laughed at this and liked it. In the same way, Levin, in his heart, despised the town mode of life of his friend, and his official duties, which he laughed at and regarded as trifling. But the difference was that Oblonsky, as he was doing the same as everyone did, laughed complacently and good-humoredly, while Levin laughed without complacency and sometimes angrily. "We have long been expecting you," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, going into his room and letting Levin's hand go as though to show that here all danger was over. "I am very, very glad to see you. How are you? When did you come?" Levin was silent, looking at the unknown faces of Oblonsky's two companions, and especially at the hand of the elegant Karenina, who had such long white fingers, such long yellow filbert-shaped nails, and such huge shining studs on his shirt cuff, that they apparently absorbed all his attention, and allowed him no freedom of thought. Oblonsky noticed this at once and smiled. "Ah, let me introduce you," he said. "My colleagues, Philip Ivanovitch Nikitin, Mihail Stanislavitch Grinovitch," and then, turning to Levin, "a district councillor, a modern district councilman, a gymnast who lifts 13 stone with one hand, a cattle breeder and a sportsman, and my friend Konstantin Dmitrovich Levin, the brother of Sergei Ivanovitch Koznishev." "Delighted," said the veteran. "I have the honor of knowing your brother, Sergei Ivanovitch," said Grinovitch, holding out his slender hand with the long nails. Levin frowned, shook hands coldly, and at once turned to Oblonsky. Though he had a great respect for his half-brother, an author well known to all of Russia, he could not endure when people treated him not as Konstantin Levin, but as the brother of the celebrated Koznishev. "No, I am no longer a district councillor. I have quarreled with them all, and I don't go to the meetings any more," he said, turning to Oblonsky. "Well, you've been quick about it," said Oblonsky with a smile. "But how?" Why? It's a long story. I'll tell you sometime, said Levin, but he began telling him at once. Well, to put it shortly, I was convinced that nothing was really done by the district councils or ever could be, he began, as though someone had just insulted him. On one side, it's a plaything. They play at being a parliament, and I'm neither young enough nor old enough to find amusement in playthings. And on the other side, he stammered, it's a means for the courtier of the district to make money. Formerly they had wardships, courts of justice. Now they have the district council, not in the form of bribes, but in the form of unearned salary, he said as hotly as though someone of those present had opposed his opinion. Ah, you're in a new phase again, I see. You're a conservative, said Stepan Arkadyevitch. However, we can go into that later. Yes, later, but I wanted to see you, said Levin, looking with hatred at Karenina's hand. Stepan Arkadyevitch gave a scarcely perceptible smile. How was it you used to say you would never wear European dress again? He said, scanning his new suit, obviously cut by a French tailor. I see a new phase. Levin suddenly blushed, not as grown men blush, slightly, without being themselves aware of it, but as boys blush, feeling that they are ridiculous through their shyness, and consequently ashamed of it, and blushing still more, almost to the point of tears. And it was so strange to see this sensible, manly face in such a childish plight that Oblonsky left off looking at him. Where shall we meet? You know I want very much to talk to you, said Levin. Oblonsky seemed to ponder. I'll tell you what. Let's go to Gurin's to lunch. There we can talk. I'm free till 3. No, answered Levin, after an instant's thought. I have got to go somewhere else. All right then, let's dine together. Dine together? But I have nothing very particular, only a few words to say and a question I want to ask, and we can have a talk afterwards. Well, say the few words then, at once, and we'll gossip after dinner. Well, it's this, said Levin, but it's of no importance, though. His face all at once took an expression of anger from the effort he was making to surmount his shyness. What are the Scherbatskys doing? Everything as it used to be? He said. Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had long known that Levin was in love with his sister-in-law, Kitty, gave a hardly perceptible smile. His eyes sparkled merrily. You said a few words, but I can't answer in a few words because... Excuse me a minute. A secretary came in with respectful familiarity and the modest consciousness characteristic of every secretary of superiority to his chief in the knowledge of business. He went up to Oblonsky with some papers and began, under pretense of asking a question, to explain some objection. Stepan Arkadyevitch, without hearing him out, laid his hand genially on the secretary's sleeve. No, you do as I told you, he said, softening his words with a smile and with a brief explanation of his view of the matter, and then he turned away from the papers and said, So do it that way, if you would please. The secretary retired in confusion. During the consultation with the secretary, Levin had completely recovered from his embarrassment. He was standing with his elbows on the back of a chair, and on his face was a look of attention. I don't understand it. I don't understand it, he said. What don't you understand? Said Oblonsky, smiling as brightly as ever, and picking up a cigarette. He expected some strange outburst from Levin. I don't understand what you are doing, said Levin, shrugging his shoulders. How can you do it seriously? Why not? Why? Because there's nothing in it. You think so, but we're overwhelmed with work. On paper, but there, you've a gift for it. That's to say, you think there's a lack of something in me? Perhaps so, said Levin. But all the same, I admire your grandeur, and I am proud I have a friend in such a great person. You've not answered my question, though, he went on, with a desperate effort looking Oblonsky straight in the face. Oh, that's all very well. You wait a bit, and you'll come to this yourself. It's all very nice for you to have over 6,000 acres in the Karenina district, and such muscles, in the freshness of a girl of 12. Still, you'll be one of us one day. Yes, and as to your question, there is no change, but it is a pity you've been away so long. Oh, why so? Levin queried, panic-stricken. Oh, nothing, responded Oblonsky. We'll talk it over. But what brought you up to town? Oh, we'll talk about that, too, later on, said Levin, reddening again up to his ears. All right, I see, said Stepan Arkadyevitch. I should ask you to come to us, you know, but my wife's not quite the thing. But I'll tell you what, if you want to see them, they're sure now to be at the Zoological Gardens from 4 to 5. Kitty skates. You drive along there, and I'll come and fetch you, and we'll go and dine somewhere together. Capital. Goodbye till then. Now mind, you'll forget. I know you, or you'll rush off home to the country, Stepan Arkadyevitch called out, laughing. No, truly, I won't. And Levin went out of the room, only when he was in the doorway, remembering that he had forgotten to take leave of Oblonsky's colleagues. That gentleman must be a man of great energy, said Karenina, when Levin had gone away. Yes, my dear boy, said Stepan Arkadyevitch, nodding his head. He's a lucky fellow. Over 6,000 acres in the Karenina district. Everything before him, and what youth and vigor. Not like some of us. Oh, you have a great deal to complain of, haven't you, Stepan Arkadyevitch? Ah, yes, I'm in a poor way, a bad way, said Stepan Arkadyevitch with a heavy sigh. Chapter 6. When Oblonsky asked Levin what had brought him to town, Levin blushed, and was furious with himself for blushing, because he could not answer, I have come to make your sister-in-law an offer, though that was precisely what he had come for. The families of the Levins and Scherbatskys were old, noble Moscow families, and had always been on intimate, friendly terms. The intimacy had grown still closer during Levin's student days. He had both prepared for the university with young Prince Scherbatsky, the brother of Kitty and Dolly, and had entered at the same time with him. In those days Levin used to often be in the Scherbatsky house, and he was in love with the Scherbatsky household. Strange as it may appear, it was with the household, the family, that Konstantin Levin was in love, especially with the feminine half of the household. Levin did not remember his own mother, and his only sister was older than he was, so that it was in the Scherbatsky's house that he saw for the first time the inner life of an old, noble, cultivated, and honorable family, of which he had been deprived by the death of both father and mother. All the members of that family, especially the feminine half, were pictured by him, as it were, wrapped about with a mysterious poetical veil, and he not only perceived no defects whatever in them, but under the poetical veil that shrouded them, he assumed the existence of the loftiest sentiments in every possible perfection. Why was it that the three young ladies had one day to speak French and the next English? Why was it that at certain hours they played by turns on the piano? the sounds of which were audible in their brother's room above, where the students used to work. Why were they visited by those professors of French literature, of music, of drawing, of dancing? Why, at certain hours, all the three young ladies, with Mademoiselle Eleanor, drove in the coach to the Tversky Boulevard, dressed in their satin cloaks, Dolly in a long one, Natalia in a half-long one, and Kitty in one so short that her shapely legs and tightly drawn red stockings were visible to all beholders? Why was it that they had to walk about the Tversky Boulevard, escorted by a footman with a gold cockade in his hat? All this and much more that was done in their mysterious world he did not understand, but he was sure that everything was done there was very good, and he was in love precisely with the mystery of the proceedings. In his student days he had all but been in love with the eldest, Dolly, but she was soon married to Oblonsky. Then he began to be in love with the second. He felt, as it were, that he had to be in love with one of the sisters, only he could not make out which. But Natalia, too, had hardly made her appearance in the world before she was married to the diplomat Ivan. Kitty was still a child when Levin left the university. Young Scherbatsky went into the navy, was drowned in the Baltic, and Levin's relations with the Scherbatskys, in spite of his friendship with Oblonsky, became less intimate. But when, early in the winter of the year, Levin came to Moscow, after a year in the country, and saw the Scherbatskys, he realized which of the three sisters he was indeed destined to love. One would have thought that nothing could be simpler for him, a man of good family, rather rich than poor, and 32 years old, to make the young Princess Scherbatsky an offer of marriage. In all likelihood he would at once have been looked upon as a good match. But Levin was in love, and so it seemed to him that Kitty was so perfect in every respect that she was a creature far above everything earthly, and that he was a creature so low and so earthly that it could not even be conceived that other people and she herself could regard him as worthy of her. After spending 2 months in Moscow in a state of enchantment, seeing Kitty almost every day in society, into which he went so as to meet her, he abruptly decided that it could not be, and went back to the country. Levin's conviction that it could not be was founded on the idea that in the eyes of her family he was a disadvantageous and worthless match for the charming Kitty, and that Kitty could not love him. In her family's eyes he had no ordinary definite career or position in society, while his contemporaries by this time, when he was 32, were already one a colonel, another a professor, another director of a bank and railways, or president of a board like Oblonsky. But he knew very well how he must appear to others, was a country gentleman, occupied in breeding cattle, shooting game, and building barns. In other words, a fellow of no ability, who had not turned out well, and who was doing just what, according to the ideas of the world, is done by people fit for nothing else. The mysterious, enchanting Kitty herself could not love such an ugly person as he conceived himself to be, and, above all, such an ordinary, in no way striking person. Moreover, his attitude to Kitty in the past, the attitude of a grown-up person to a child arising from his friendship with her brother, seemed to him yet another obstacle to love. An ugly, good-natured man, as he considered himself, might, he supposed, be liked as a friend, but to be loved with such a love as that with which he loved Kitty, one would need to be a handsome and, still more, a distinguished man. He had heard that women often did care for ugly and ordinary men, but he did not believe it, for he judged by himself, and he could not himself have loved any but beautiful, mysterious, and exceptional women. But after spending 2 months alone in the country, he was convinced that this was not one of those passions of which he had experience in his early youth, that this feeling gave him not an instant's rest, that he could not live without deciding the question, would she or would she not be his wife, and that his despair had arisen only from his own imaginings, that he had no sort of proof that he would be rejected, and he had now come to Moscow with a firm determination to make an offer and get married if he were accepted, or he could not conceive what would become of him if he were rejected.